Hello, welcome. I'm Farrell Hoy-Janab. I'm the Director of Faculty Development, and I'm very pleased to introduce Deb today. I do have an extra credit sign-in sheet for any students who want to sign this, and I'll give it to your teacher. So the College Scholar Program showcases faculty excellence in research fields that go beyond the classroom to make scholarly contributions to knowledge within the professor's academic discipline. So this award began in 2010, and this is actually Deb's fourth time to receive the award since 2010. So Deb Williams has accomplishments too many to tell you all about here. She's taught biology and environmental science at JCCC since 2006. Is that right? And during that time, she also served as Faculty Association President and lead negotiator. She's also taught at KU Washburn, KU and Haskell Indian Nations University. She's won numerous awards, including JCCC's Distinguished Service Award, the BNSF Railway Faculty Award, and too many really to read out here. Some of her more recent accomplishments include serving as a board member for the American Wolf Foundation, which is an organization that is dedicated to conservation of wolves, particularly the critically endangered red wolf. So that's quite an interesting tidbit, I think. And her work serving on the JCCC Diversity and Equity Inclusion Task Force is another recent thing. She has multiple degrees, including a JD, a master's in Indigenous Studies, a master's in Philosophy, a master's in Curriculum and Instruction, a master's in Biology, a master's in Student Counseling and Personnel Services, bachelor's in Animal Science, bachelor's in Life Science, and she's working on her PhD in Cultural Anthropology. So she jokingly referred to herself as Graduate Student Emeritus, which I think is an apt name. I would say about Deb, she's a charismatic and inspirational teacher, and all who know her know the passion and integrity she brings to everything she does. So please welcome Deb Williams.
Thank you, Farrell. Am I on? Awesome. So I'm not used to having all this space, so if I wander around, I'll just apologize in advance. I'm just really pleased to be here. I'm happy to see so many people turn out for this topic. When I was driving up here today, I thought maybe I should have a warning label on the first slide or the second slide, because I'll tell you, we're going to get in the weeds. If you haven't figured that out by the title yet, that this has some esoteria to it. It has a few different nuanced perspectives that pull from different discipline areas, including philosophy. But if I had to characterize it, I guess I would say it's an applied archaeology or an applied philosophy class or lecture. I mean, why choose? There's some interesting things to say about this topic. So scientific consequentialism, potential problems with an outcome-driven paradigm for the scientific study of metaphysically inclusive peoples. I'll try to explain a little bit of that along the way, because it's probably too much to do right now. Scientific consequentialism is important to the story, and you're going to see one of the slides that's going to come up is a list of terms filled with definitions of philosophical perspectives as it relates to assumptions that we as scientists make. And for now, I will put on the hat of a scientist, because part of what I am trying to do with this project is, and the other companion presentation that I'm giving this year for this College Scholar series, is look at ways in which Western science and native science can be cooperative, where we can find common ground. And it turns out the story behind this one was, as I was doing what's called a field statement in anthropology, which is a very, very, very intense lit review, I encountered something I thought was problematic, because every other place where you hear me talk, you will hear me talk about the complementarity of native and Western science. You will hear me talk about the importance of including, having inclusive educational spaces and research spaces for native and Western scholarship. But there is a problem, I think, in something that I'm seeing in a debate that's pretty alive in the archaeological literature. And so what I've done is I didn't start the debate, but I take a side, I refine, maybe nuance an argument, and then I issue a warning about what could potentially fall out of what I call an extreme form of Indigenous archaeology, or you'll see extreme form of 4. So you know that this is a serious academic presentation because I'm going to quote Foucault. I quote him twice, actually. I found this kind of at the end of last spring, and I'll let you read it for a second, and you can decide what you think that means to you, but this might serve as my warning, that not only that we're getting into the weeds, but that there are some problems sometimes. Sometimes it's safe to think things. Sometimes it gets a little bit more dangerous when you express them, and particularly when you have possible careers on the line or perspectives on the line. And what I'm hoping to do with this conversation is just show, again, the merits of a particular approach, the complementarity of an inclusive approach, but also some problems if we take some of these ideas too far. So thought is no longer theoretical. As soon as it functions, it offends or reconciles, attracts or repels, breaks, disassociates, unites or reunites. So basically, you can read the rest, but what I take out of this is thoughts are safe while they're thoughts. But as soon as you deploy them, sometimes people can align and have different ideas about what you have to say. And sometimes that requires further conversation. So I hope that what I have to say today does not offend. I hope it inspires, and I hope it provokes conversation. So this is actually kind of a refined abstract. I have a paper ready to publish, and it's on this topic, scientific consequentialism. And so if I had to distill down into the next 45 minutes or so of what I'm going to talk about, it's right here. First, you need to know that scientific consequentialism, or at least you need to know consequentialism is an ethical theory. Scientific consequentialism, the way I use it here, is as follows. It's a position that the rightness and wrongness of scientific research is determined by its effects on individuals or groups rather than by its adherence to the ideals of the scientific method. Now you'll notice I have some words italicized and underlined. That's my way of kind of having a conversation with myself. Also, when I'm presenting, I can jump to those words and provoke my own thinking so that we don't have to read every word. But what I'm trying to set up here is that using the language of ethics, right, wrong, should not. Typically, you don't see those words, by the way, in comments about science. You might see it about science, but you don't see that presented in science. I'm arguing that scientific consequentialism does this thing, and that many elements of indigenous archaeology, which I'll explain is an approach that popped up as a response to colonial approaches to the past, and I think it's a good thing. It's actually an example of science that I think works complementary with Western science. But many elements of indigenous archaeology are important to making Western science more respectful of indigenous concerns and more applicable to studying people with metaphysically inclusive worldviews. And that's one I'm going to have to explain here in a minute. But however, there are some proponents that I think are taking this a bit too far. And so you scroll down here, you'll see that the going way that indigenous archaeology is presented in the literature is that it is an approach that is by, with, and for indigenous peoples. I'm going to take on what I'm going to call an extreme form of for. And what this middle part tells you is the worry is this may include some approaches that suppress undesirable research or results. It might involve avoiding certain kinds of research questions entirely, all for the morally required good of decolonization. So decolonization is going to come up as a theme in this presentation too, as it necessarily has to. So the end there tells you the extreme outcome-driven form of indigenous archaeology, in my view, is irreconcilable with and even antithetical to the ideals of Western science. It risks unintended negative consequences over the long term, and in my view, it is no more appropriate now to support decolonial agendas than were consequentialist efforts in the past to support colonial agendas. So I'm going to be very fair and balanced, I hope, in this presentation. So here's Foucault again. It's fundamentally about power. I mean, if you really want to start the conversation, we can center it around a discussion of power. And we know Foucault is famous for talking about power and discourse and the importance of controlling, the conversation. So here, I have this paraphrase, I guess. Foucault, French philosopher and social theorist, argued discourse that invokes scientific rationality illuminates ontological power struggles, and it's the indigenous people's ontologies that become subjugated. I don't think there's any controversy about that statement. We have numerous examples where indigenous people's ontologies have become subjugated to the Western scientific paradigm. And so you'll see this name, Sonia Adelaide is an indigenous archaeologist who writes a lot about indigenous archaeology. And so you'll see her a lot because I like a lot of what she says. And so she offers indigenous archaeology involves finding ways to create a counter discourse that speaks back to the power of colonialist and imperialist interpretations of the past. So we know that there's two sides here that's starting to unfold. And then just as a reminder, or maybe for the first time you've encountered the word ontology, oops, you have a definition here at the bottom. Philosophical study of being, more broadly studying concepts related to being, in particular becoming, existence, reality, and so on. So there is, again, some philosophy to this conversation. So it's about power. It's fundamentally about power, but I would argue it's also about worldviews. And so I have in my title, metaphysically inclusive versus metaphysically exclusive. And this is something that came out that I offered in a recent paper that I published with my co-author, that we're looking at science as a worldview and looking at indigenous perspectives as a worldview, realizing that there's more than one indigenous worldview. But if you look for common features and for comparative purposes, one of the places where we can talk about a comparison is not whether someone or a group of people is primitive or traditional or modern or not. We can look at worldview. And I think this kind of helps maybe refine the language a little bit and closes the attention in on some real points of comparison. So I look at worldviews as how we represent and understand our place and relationships in the world, often characterized by their subjective content, and we know that science often is believed to be objective and secular, so it's often thought of as not having worldview content. I hope to convince you, if that's your thinking, that that is not the case. However, worldviews are much more broadly concerned with interpreting and interacting with the world, and ultimately, we see with worldview content, it includes the kinds of questions that are asked, the methodology that is used to answer them, and the acceptabilities of those answers. So if we walk back to what I said earlier, native versus Western science, and if you follow some, and I've cited some people who've informed those ideas along the way, then you can see how you could come up with a list of characteristics for a Western scientific worldview, or a list of characteristics for a native science worldview, and see some differences. So here's where I get into a little bit more description of the metaphysically exclusive and inclusive. So I approach Western science as metaphysically exclusive, and indigenous worldview being metaphysically inclusive, where the former does not recognize metaphysical phenomenon and explanations, and the latter does. So the study and understanding of peoples whose worldviews include metaphysical content, like we know often a lot of indigenous peoples does, can be potentially a tension point. So down here I say in anthropology and archaeology, it has negatively impacted the study of those Native American and other indigenous peoples whose knowledge, traditions, and worldviews make very few distinctions or inextricably link the metaphysical to the physical world. So that's the subject of a whole other paper, but it's something I think that informs this one just to help kind of stake out some potential differences. But I don't think that all is lost in just because there are some distinctions doesn't mean that there aren't some opportunities to find common ground. So here's where we get into maybe taking a closer look at science. So we know that science carries a lot of force and effect in our society. If you don't think so, STEM. part of the title of my other college scholar talk is looking at cultural taboos as a factor in the participation rate of Native Americans in STEM. We know that in the universe there's been a response by arts, humanities folks to put some STEAM back in STEM, to incorporate into the focus on science other kinds of disciplinary contributions. So we know, probably again, it's not controversial at all, that science carries great authority in Western society. As a result, some have argued that it largely controls what is learned, what is funded, what is studied, how it's studied, what is published, and so on. And so seeking greater legitimacy, we had a phase in the past, and this is, you can see the, oops, you see the date there, 1967. There was a point in time where a lot of other disciplines were really embracing the Western scientific tradition. And so to the point where Feldheimer, who I quote up here, cautions us, wrong thinking in the natural sciences is lamentable, but sooner or later will be rejected. Wrong thinking in the social sciences may escape this fate, thus it's not merely lamentable but dangerous. And it's kind of a tip for those of you who aren't that familiar with the scientific method or the process of peer review, that in the natural sciences, in the Western science tradition, when you publish something and it's up for peer review, there's scrutiny, and often something doesn't last long if it doesn't. It's a self-correcting business, I think, is one way to think about science. And so his worry back in the day, in 1967, is do we have a similar, even if we're trying to embrace the aspects of science that make sense for a different discipline, are we losing something if we don't also have a system that will put checks on what we put out there? So that was a worry that may come up as a theme in what I have to say. So here I warned you about this, that in a fair and balanced approach, I'm going to take a closer look at science. And I warned people before they got here, that some of you got here, that there was a slide that was filled with terms that were philosophy terms, only to show a brief summary of philosophical foundations of Western science, but also, I think, to make my point, which is going to be made throughout, that Western science, that these need to be presented in order to understand the philosophical assumptions and to appreciate that, contrary to some people's belief, that science is not objective, not universal, and not acultural. So these terms, I'm not going to read them all. They're there if you want the slide set. But realism, empiricism, and positivism, those first three are pretty helpful to my presentation. Realism or objectivism, ontological assumption that an objective reality exists independent of our minds. This, again, these are foundations of Western science, not philosophy. These are underpinnings of scientific thought. Empiricism, which is an epistemological assumption that at least some of the aspects of that objective reality can be observed and measured. That should sound familiar to the scientists in the room. And then positivism, which is even stronger epistemological assumption that knowledge that is not derived from the scientific method is not objective and therefore cannot be validated. So therein lies, I just said that there's a group, many groups of people that have metaphysically inclusive views of the world. And we have science that's putting a premium on that which you can gauge and measure and taste and touch and feel and empirically derive, to the point where if it can't be validated, that might say something about whether it exists at all. And that's a trajectory that some scientists go down that I think is problematic. The rest of the isms work with those terms, but I want to call your attention to this last line, that many today, if you think about these terms and accept that some of this really is the case with science, many argue that we live in a post-positive time, and yet clearly physical science and many social sciences are still very much invested in following this positivist paradigm, the part that says that if it's not objective and not gaugeable, then you can't validate it, so what do we really have? So if that's where we are today, you can see why there might be some tensions between groups that have a more metaphysical view of the world versus, or at least incorporated into their view of the world, versus one that puts the premium on the metaphysically exclusive approach. So keep in mind that there's at least one alternative position which may be favored by other peoples with alternative worldviews. Even if you are firmly entrenched in the positivist paradigm, realize that there are other ways of approaching the world. So that's important to the discussion. So again, just to be equally critical, Stephen Jay Gould is an ecology and evolutionary biologist. He's a paleontologist. He wrote quite a bit about, he actually offered an alternative view of evolution, the Darwinian gradualist model. He had something called punctuated equilibrium, which is very fascinating look at things. But he wrote a paper, and he was talking about philosophy and science being perceived by some as non-overlapping magisteria. And I'm here to say, I hope, that that is not the view that's carried today, because I think my life, I mean, if in the list of degrees that were presented, I have 8 and 1 on the way. Philosophy was law was number 5, philosophy was number 6, and Indigenous studies was number 7. I think things got really interesting in my scholarly life when I formally studied philosophy. It informed my science, it informed my law. It's extremely important as a disciplinary perspective, but also as disciplining of your mind. But you can see how, even maybe in your own educational experience, I can say this of mine, that siloed thinking was pretty common. So Gould has that out there about non-overlapping magisteria, and I'm trying to show that that's hopefully not still the case, and actually a detriment if it is. There's a criticism up here about Western science being arrogant in that view. So part of the arrogance of Western science has been that it sets itself within a hall of mirrors, mistakes its reflection for the world, sees its own reflections endlessly, talks endlessly to itself, and not surprisingly finds continual verification of itself in its worldview. Ideally, social sciences need to break free from this hall of mirrors and affirm the existence and value of the knowledge of other knowledge systems. So leave a little room for alternative ways of knowing. So another way of saying this is, obviously no one can attack science too much, because science has done some very wonderful things for our experience, our existence, medicine, technologies, and so on. So one way of reconciling this is to put science properly privileging it within its own domain, namely the construction of a naturalistic understanding of natural phenomenon. So I go on to say in this paper that, and this was the published one that this part is based on, that there's nothing inherently wrong, really, with Western scientific worldview, as long as there's some acknowledgement of particular limitations. And I think it's the hardest thing in teaching students even today, that in a world where so much privilege is given to science, that there are limits to science. There's limits, especially if you're going to put your whole methodology, base your whole methodology on things that you can see, taste, touch, measure, gauge, observe in some way. Because there is a whole lot of other aspects of existence that are not amenable to those tools. So what do we do with those kinds of considerations? Do you say they don't exist, or do you say nothing at all? Either way, we miss out. So Western archaeology and Indigenous archaeology, like I said, if we look at Indigenous archaeology, we can see an opportunity where these seemingly conflicting worldviews can come together. And as you saw from Adelaide's previous quote, Indigenous archaeology arose in response to post-colonial critiques of archaeological practices, particularly the privileging of Western perspectives. So there's a power imbalance with colonization, and we know that, not questioned, that allowed archaeologists to study cultural and temporal others in a process involving othering. So you enter into the scene Indigenous archaeology that offers a different way of thinking. So as I said earlier, the common way of thinking about Indigenous archaeology is a paradigm that's by, with, and for Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous archaeology provides, I think, a well-developed example of how Western scientific perspectives and Indigenous perspectives could potentially come together. And so it's going to go a little bit faster now because I want to certainly get to the time where I give some examples and then open it up for questions. But so I have some quotes that are associated with the by, with, and for, and this is just reminding us that we're still working out what that means. The by, with, and for are still being established, and the literature is filled with a number of win-win situations, so I can make good on the claim that an Indigenous archaeological approach does have merit and worth and has actually been very informative to Western archaeological projects as well. But while I agree that Western scientific practice far too often ignores the concerns and effects of its subjects and would benefit from greater communication and collaboration with all of its stakeholders, I believe efforts to address this problem can be taken too far. And for this part, I will talk a little bit more about what I call the extreme form of for. So you have some names up there, and again, this field statement, I think, was like 74 pages when it was finished, and 20 pages or so of references. So I try along the way to show you that I'm not just cherry picking these ideas. There's some real data behind it or some thought behind it. So in terms of decolonizing archaeology, Smith and Jackson and Steves are the ones that came to the forefront of my thinking when I put this slide set together. So again, some of this not controversial to accept on its face. Modern archaeology inherited a deeply colonial legacy. Indigenous peoples have a right to expect archaeologists to assist with the decolonization of archaeology is one claim that was made by two of these thinkers. Another, Steves, wrote that colonialism violently transformed and erased the identities of Indigenous peoples, and decolonizing knowledge production should work to unerase entire communities. That's where it got to become a little bit interesting to me, because then it started looking like there was a preconceived agenda to the work that was to be done, even though we have numerous examples of really good work that had been done that's contributed to the body of knowledge that's out there. So another quote here, in that light, the trajectory of Indigenous research is clearly focused on directions of decolonizing, rewriting, reclaiming, and self-determination along paths of post-colonial healing in a neo-colonial world. So science framed by the institution of natural science is the dominant discourse and simultaneously reinforces the authority of the academy and the subservient positioning of Indigenous peoples. So I found that to be troubling, because we just saw how science is privileged, and we know that we're operating in the backdrop of a deep colonial legacy. But what do we do with that to move the science forward? What do we do? Maybe unerasing decolonial legacies is not the target we're going to ever really hit, but we should certainly approach things differently than we have. So then I find people like Echohawk, who says this, what I would call as a strong form of by. Maybe part of the agenda needs to include more Native American scholars or Indigenous scholars generally in the conversation. So the incorporation of the Indigenous viewpoint in the academics can normalize their culture and the overall historical narrative and shift away from portraying Indigenous peoples as, quote, savage, and instead evaluating them equally with other world cultures. So that seems fair enough. So then I go back to Adelaide and another couple of authors, Silliman and Watkins, and so they're writing about Indigenous archaeology, offering us the strong form of myth. So characterizing as a collaborative approach, and again, there's a lot of words here. Basically what it says is there's a distinction to be made between consultation and collaboration, and if you really are going to champion a strong form of with, collaboration entails active engagement in all, and you can see what they list these, in all aspects of a research project, including design, project formulation, development, initiation, data recovery, laboratory analysis, and publication. So if you really are collaborating, you're doing all of those things all the time along the way. So here's where I encountered this, what I would call an extreme form of for. And Steve's is an example of this. She's not the only person who is writing, but here's a quote, and I'll let you think about it, and then I'll try to paraphrase my worry. So she may have made the strongest statement on this issue by stating that Indigenous archaeology by Indigenous scholars and communities is carried out by people who are resisting Eurocentric authority and control. She says it's a political act focused on reclaiming control of the Indigenous past and the present. It's carried out with and for Indigenous people, and political control of cultural information is critical to the survival and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights and sovereignty. So my worry is, and I've kind of mixed some of Steve's actual language with my own characterization of the worry, if archaeological and historical data are not merely neutral pieces of information and are fundamentally fouled, in her words, with political and neo-colonial views and ideas, then the question to me is, it becomes whose political and neo-colonial ideas will it reflect, colonial or indigenous? And so I will say, again, to be even-handed in my approach, that either way, if you're colonial in your agenda or you're decolonizing in your agenda and you are a scientist, that invites certain kinds of problems for the credibility of the work that's to come. So a few other quotes from Steve's, quoting Duran. So she made an appeal to archaeologists and other scientists to use science to heal what Duran referred to as soul wounds of Indigenous people. The intergenerational legacies of trauma passed on from one generation to the next, including identity erasure, created in part through archaeological cleaved links to ancestral places and time due to colonization, and asserted that research should serve and inform the political liberation struggle, and it must be overly political. Must be, should. These are value-laden terms, and we're talking about an approach to the past of science. So it's unclear how archaeologists should employ science to these ends, in my view, but Adelaide seemed to accept that the extreme form goes beyond mere equalization. And this is what I call Adelaide's contradictory critique. I actually very much like Adelaide's perspective, but I think in this particular quote, she reinforces the worry about, as I said earlier, she's talked about a situation where she herself, and she's an Indigenous scholar, but she was labeled as a colonist, someone who was doing nothing different than the Western scholars had done before me, forcing my Indigenous worldview on others. But then she goes on to say, we must sometimes use the master's tools, in this case, critique and academic scholarship, to create a counter-discourse to Western approaches that have consistently worked to destroy our silence or our Indigenous ways of knowing. And so I think let that sink in, again, as we move into what I think is a potential reconciliation. So what I'm going for is a reasonable form of for. I argue for a reasonable but a strong form of for, where archaeology in particular and Western science generally invites greater collaboration with people without losing sight of its own ideals. And so I've already said that, ideals. The scientific method is not acultural. It's not detached from philosophies. It's not performed by objective beings. We have bias in our we make mistakes as scientists. So it's not perfect, but the ideal of the scientific method allows for objectivity and approaches that could inform potentially our understanding of the world. And I think when we embed political agendas or we have an outcome in mind, that could be disconcerting. So my reconciliation is to offer a reasonable form of for, and again, reinforce that many examples already exist where the Indigenous archaeology has been important in informing and working cooperatively with and extending even Western science contributions. However, with regard to the extreme form of Indigenous archaeology, I'd have to agree with someone else who's very much in the debate, McGee, who argued if archaeologists are repentant for and concerned about being the unwitting pawns of colonial governments and their agendas, the solution is not to become the willing pawns of indigenous governments and their agendas. So we're not achieving much if we take one problematic historical offering and replace it with an equally problematic approach. So the scientific study of indigenous people can and should, now I'm arguing with value-laden philosophical terms, it can and should be improved by greater collaboration with its subjects and stakeholders, but in doing so, scientists must continue to aspire to strive for the ideals of neutrality and objectivity of Western scientific approaches. So I give 3 examples in this last part, and I think I'm going to have time to get through most of them. And these represent, and you'll see, cannibalism in the Southwest. I'm going to give the issue, and I'm going to give the consequentialist response, and then try to offer some critique to that. So obviously, cannibalism can be a divisive subject. This particular quote is calling our attention to an argument that the claim of cannibalism has been used to differentiate and racially divide so-called civilized from uncivilized others. So then you have some who are in the camp of decolonializing the narrative, arguing that any characterization of Indians as cannibals dredges up a long history of oppression and racism, and we have to realize that this may generate ill will and negative emotions. So the consequentialist response, and I'm certainly not going to go through all of that, but realize there's a lot of people who've written on this. They're given examples of how, in the view of those who were writing, that the call was to suppress undesirable research or results that might have this perceived effect. So again, if suppression is the upfront end game, that may not be doing much to further our understanding of the way things are, but it also might ultimately undercut the approach entirely. So cannibalism is one of the examples that came up in the literature. Another was, if we're going to talk about cannibalism, then we have to make sure we're clear on that it happened. There has to be unassailable evidence. The stakes are so high that it has to be, the level of evidentiary standard has to be as high as we can make it. And so maybe it's just me as an ecologist, but I have some questions, and I'll ask the historians in the room. You can answer during Q&A or whenever you feel comfortable. As an ecologist, I don't have a big problem with cannibalism as a response to survival instinct. I know it's not probably ideal to have Dennis Arjo stew on the menu, but I see as an ecologist that if you're encountering food scarcity, then there might be a logical response to consider this as an option to get your nutritional needs met, for lack of a better way of putting it. I also think it's problematic to say or to worry about potential colonial approaches having an issue with it, because we have examples of cannibalism in our own colonial narrative. Jamestown, the Donner Party. So it's not like it hasn't happened in the past, and I think maybe there might be something with further conversation we don't have to keep out of the conversation. Maybe we don't have to, we should have very good evidence for sure, but this idea of raising the bar so high that we don't talk about it at all for the sake of having potentially a negative connotation pop out of it may not be all that big of a worry. This next issue, I'm going to, for sake of time, I'm going to tie it to the third issue because it's very much tied to it, I think. The Ancient One or Kennewick Man controversy has to do, the issue was long tenure and cultural continuity. So as you may recall, because this was only recently resolved, was that there was remains found along a stretch of the Columbia River during apparently like a recreational event, like a canoe event. So it was found by just local residents, and to make a long story short, the remains were it was clear that they were old. It was interesting to people who study archaeology and anthropology, because where it was found, it could have potentially informed the next issue, which is the origin story Beringia hypothesis worry. And so you had two competing draws on this historical point in time. You had all the members of the 5 tribes in the area claiming this individual is our ancestor, needs to be returned to us for proper ceremony and burial. And you had archaeologists who were arguing this could be informative to the peopling of America's narrative. Who owns the past? Become, kind of a philosophical question, I guess. Are these remains part of the public domain? Do we not owe the public the answer, if we can ask the questions and get the answers as to potentially this migration story? And so all this stuff was out there floating in the ethers about this topic. Ultimately, it was a prolonged court battle that resolved this, and the remains were indeed found to be Native American. They were eventually repatriated. I wrote a different paper on this topic for a class, that what I found puzzling is there was clearly a scientific dimension. There was clearly an ethical dimension, but what won the day or resolved the issue was law, which sometimes, unfortunately, isn't either. Ideally, it is informed by science and law, but it turned out that there was a piece of legislation called the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act that kicked in, and ultimately, with a lot of legal maneuvering, the right outcome was had, but not without a lot of cost and a lot of anguish and a lot of controversy. So long tenure and cultural continuity it illustrates this particular case. Kennewick man to the Western scientists, the ancient one to the native peoples in the area, can show you how adversarial this conflict can become. So a consequentialist approach would have been avoiding research entirely, because again, there's implications on when and who potentially arrived first, as the literature discusses. Although the Kennewick man case, in that case, the tribe's actual arguments, and I think this is important to underscore, were based largely on avoiding the desecration of the remains. What was in the backdrop of the debate was this worry about a qualitative versus a quantitative distinction between who got here first, which leads to this other issue. And I think, again, it's tied to Kennewick man, but it's its own, in its own right. Origin is a key qualitative distinction between indigenous and colonial, and it's the ultimate basis for the former's claims against the other. So a lot of stuff there. Deloria has written on this, has some very strong ideas. Steves, who I mentioned earlier, you can guess she has some ideas on this. So she's argued to accept that indigenous peoples have been in the Western Hemisphere for over 60,000 years and possibly prior to 100,000 years BP is to put them on equal footing with areas of the so-called Old World. So her agenda, and I'm using that purposefully in this for what the rest I have to say, is to establish a long tenure because it impacts the social and political lives of the contemporary people. So does the science back that up? I mean, I've had debates with people, or not debates, but conversations with people in the room about what we have to inform the Beringia narrative is not much. I mean, we have isolated pieces of data, we have some genetic information, the map there in the middle. You probably have all seen this in history books. But I've been in classes at the graduate level where Native American students, when they heard this story presented, got up and walked out of the room. This is very much an issue to Native peoples today, and one that we need to take seriously in our discussions about our past. So, and again, one of the consequentialist approaches is to politicize the interpretation, and so that, of course, is a worry, I think, for the field if that is the approach taken. So I'm going to try to wrap it up real quick to give you guys time to ask questions. So I would say I'd wrap it all back up by saying that the scientific study of indigenous peoples can and should be improved by greater collaboration with its subjects and other stakeholders. And I've said that in pretty much every college scholar presentation and everything I've written on this subject. our understanding only stands to gain when we're inclusive of people who have potentially something to offer to that understanding. But this can be achieved without abandoning the ideals of neutrality and objectivity of the Western scientific worldview, and also without subjugating indigenous peoples by upholding flawed and incomplete colonial narratives of the past. Indigenous and Western science, while distinguishable, have points of ideological intersection that could complement and co-extend each other if we work to find common ground. I think Indigenous archaeology is a great example of that, where science, by, with, and for, has produced fruitful results. What I went through quickly, but hopefully gave you a feel for, is that there are examples where an extreme form of for, with an outcome-driven paradigm, could potentially undercut some of those gains. I think science at its best seeks to know, which is the actual translation of science from its Latin origin, and expands understanding of the natural world. Science at its worst is fettered by politics, agendas, and endgames, and arguably isn't science at all. So regardless of who's driving the agenda, I think outcome-driven paradigms are antithetical to the ideals of sound scientific inquiry, and that we have opportunities and a lot of important work that we need to continue to do. Thank you.
So something I thought of when you brought up how research is politically driven and trying to keep it as neutral as possible is that neutrality is inherently a political stance as well. And along with that, having a neutral stance is based on the ideas of what we consider, in a sense, objectively logical based on our reasoning systems. So any neutral stance is still clouded by our own subjective logic and research and history behind that. So something I was wondering is, since you can't have a fully non-politicized stance on the subject, and it is inevitably for someone is then deciding which way the for should fully lean. And based on the history as presented, I completely understand the stance of the strong for Indigenous peoples. However, to some very small degree, that for, based on that history, is still a colonial history of the situation that's being presented. So how do you arrive at a for Indigenous peoples based off of Indigenous peoples' histories?
That's a great question, and I think you started to give a great summary of that whole first part that took so long to unfold. That yes, there are choices to be made, and we as we're not robots, we're not perfectly designed to make 100% of the time logical, objective decisions. And so that's always going to inform our science, it's going to inform our policy, it's going to inform our law, it's going to inform pretty much every decision that we make. But I think you answered your own question at the end, and the way that you achieve, I think, a reasonable form of for, or a better outcome, is to involve the people that are stakeholders in the discussion themselves. And I think having, fortunately, more and more Native scholars, Indigenous scholars generally, enter the literati, enter the conversation, skilled and trained and able to work with the Western paradigm. It helps to have conversations where people can talk along the same terms, because I would think it would be harder, just knowing some of the people I grew up with as a scholar, it would be harder to bring some of them along over to understanding Indigenous ways of knowing than to bring along potentially Native scholars to understand the Western scientific paradigm. There are some obstacles, which is what I talk about in the other presentation, obstacles that we can remove. But very important, I think, to have people who are invested, informed, impacted by these decisions a part of the conversation every step of the way. I really like that part. The by part, the strong by part, I really like. The strong with, I really like. And I've seen productive results show up in the literature. Thank you.
We're about out of time. Anybody else have a question? One last question.
Told you it was going to be in the weeds. So if you want to talk more, please feel free to email me. I had my, I'll put it back up. I'm also, for students in the room, I'm going to be teaching an honors forum in the spring on Native and Western views of nature. It's an honors forum, but it's open to non-honors students too, if you're interested. If you're not a part of the honors program, Monday evening, 6 to 8:30. And again, what I try to do is show multiple perspectives, and I will bring Native scholars and Western scholars into the classroom so that it's not just Deb. Thank you.